I'd like to ask you, if I may, about the international sanctions regime, often called Magnitsky sanctions, and whether you think that these work well. Are they being used effectively against perpetrators of transnational repression in the UK? And I suppose I should mention that at least three of us who've been around the table today have been sanctioned by a number of the regimes that you pointed to, and do find it passing strange that those responsible for the incarceration of nearly 2,000 pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong, or for what the House of Commons has described as a genocide in Xinjiang, that Magnitsky sanctions don't seem to be being used against some of those. So what part do they have to play in this general problem? Let's start, if we may, though, with Ms. Gallagher.
Yes, I'll take this quite briefly. My view, Lord Alton, is that the Magnitsky sanctions regime is not being used at all effectively as matters currently stand. There are remarkable gaps in terms of very egregious human rights abuses where they are not being used. Quite often it seems, and again this is not a party political point, this is successive governments, what we tended to see is that Magnitsky sanctions are used in the UK quite late in the piece, so we're not a leader. So quite often you'll see it's only when other states like the US or Canada have actually dealt with an issue and it's become essentially unassailable, and it's quite late on in the process that the UK will join the bandwagon. And that was not supposed to be what the system was in place for. And I'm particularly concerned where you have situations where the UK has direct skin in the game. There's UK nationals affected, there's UK residents affected, and there's egregious human rights abuses which are happening, and yet you don't see the state being held to account. So it does seem to me, just in terms of an overarching point, and something that I think should be an overarching recommendation from this committee on this issue of transnational repression, it's now morphed to become a systematic tool in a number of countries' toolboxes. Particularly some of the countries we mentioned earlier. And we are not seeing a corresponding policy stance which holds those countries to account in a robust and consistent way. And Magnitsky sanctions are one way in which we're not seeing those countries held to account for these abuses in a robust and consistent way. But there are many others. And I think that would be my overarching point, would be that we have got to start showing countries which behave in this way that there are political consequences. And at the moment we're not doing that.
Would you agree that the way in which we oversee the sanctions is very opaque and often very contradictory, and there is no parliamentary oversight? Is that something that perhaps you've given any thought to, and whether you think maybe there should be some degree, even if it was in camera, maybe just made up of privy councillors, but there should be parliamentarians at some point, maybe the Intelligence and Security Committee, for instance, but there is no parliamentary oversight. So there seems to be no consistency or logic about the way in which sanctions are used, and there seems no way of challenging it.
So the way in which the process works means you only see what comes out at the very end of the sausage machine when a decision has been made, and you don't see the cogs and what's actually gone into the decision making, and as you say, there's no parliamentary oversight in it. And sometimes a decision not to sanction may well be for very good reason. There might be a critical risk, there may be a backroom channel which is really important in relation to a British national who's currently in country who's being targeted in a particular way, and actually sanctions, they've got good intelligence to suggest that it would be inappropriate for sanctions, and it could make matters worse, for example. There could be very good reason in a range of circumstances, but we simply don't see that. And I think giving thought to, and I won't do this on the hoof today, but I'd be happy to give you some further thoughts in more detail. I do think opening what is currently an entirely behind closed doors and non-transparent process to some better level of scrutiny is important. And that could be done in a range of ways. But at the moment, as you say, it operates entirely opaquely. And I am concerned at what we see at the end of the sausage machine. I'm concerned at the end result, which suggests ad hocery, not a consistent approach, and fundamental gaps in holding certain states to account for egregious conduct.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Chubb, do you want to add to that? And then we'll hear from Ms. Harth.
Just very quickly, Magnitsky sanctions, are they being used well in respect of transnational repression? Of course not. There aren't examples of them being successfully deployed as a penalty for acts of transnational repression. Problem one, perhaps the the threshold for the application of Magnitsky sanctions is very, very high, such that the routine acts of transnational repression that generate these repressive effects here in the UK would very often not rise to that threshold, and so perhaps not an option to begin with. Then you have the problem of the selective and non-transparent process of deciding who to apply it to. So both of those things are problems that I think need to be addressed with, again, to bring it back to our human rights institutional setup. I think an independent statutory agency or body which is monitoring the existence and the occurrence of these types of issues can then make recommendations, independent recommendations, on perhaps not rising to the level of Magnitsky sanctions, but at least ineligibility for a visa, for example, recommendations to the Home Office, recommendations to the Foreign Office about diplomatic representations. I think it all starts with that contact point and getting the flows of information and the level of community trust up in order to be able to then have a trusted arm's length mechanism that could be then applied in a more consistent way, that the government in turn then can, rather than it being a political decision where we've decided to apply the sanctions to this country and not to that country, it's out of our hands. It's the independent human rights monitor that decides if someone is recommended to be ineligible, for example, for entry into the country, etc. So again, going back to that institutional design and the contact point.
Thank you, very helpful. Ms. Harth, finally.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Lord Alton actually for the suggestion of having indeed some parliamentary oversight, and as you said, with certain restrictions on publicity and so on, to get more insight into what really is a black box. And I would suggest that, whatever setup that ends up being is not only informed of what has been done, but also why is it not being used, and why is this country not being targeted? Why are these people not on the list? So getting very clear answers, and that both with regard to sanctions, to some extent it could also include visa restrictions, but I think it should also include other diplomatic measures, right? We've seen some incidents in the UK where members of the diplomatic corps have been openly caught in the act of engaging in transnational repression in unacceptable behavior. And I think everybody is still a bit shocked at what was the non-response afterwards. So again, also looking at that and being able to get very clear responses on why things are not being done would be crucial.